Good evening. I would like to welcome you all to this evening's event, Report on Rojava, a forum on Northern Syria. I'm the Reverend Dr. Colin Bosson, the interim senior minister of this congregation, the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston. Before I begin, I'd like to take the opportunity to tell you a little bit about our congregation and religious tradition, and of course, let you know that the bathrooms are through that door and down the hall. Unitarian Universalism is a religious tradition that celebrates the possibility of goodness within each human heart, the transformative power of love, and the clarifying force of reason. We believe that we need not think alike to love alike. Our communion includes both atheists and believers. Our religious communion contains some of the oldest congregations in the United States. The First Parish of Plymouth, Massachusetts, the congregation founded by the Pilgrims in 1606, and the First Church in Boston are both ours. Here in Houston, the First Unitarian Universalist Church is proud to have been the first historically white church to desegregate in 1954. We continue to be a religious home for all who wish to join us, welcoming the GLBT community, declaring that love has no borders, proclaiming that Black Lives Matter, toiling to address the climate crisis, and struggling for democracy. We've organized tonight's event in conjunction with the Kurdish American Foundation of Houston. It is a non-political, non-religious organization dedicated to celebrating Kurdish culture through sponsoring festivals and cultural events like this one. Rojava is the region in northern Syria that was attacked by the Turkish military following the decision by the President of the United States, Donald Trump, to pull troops from the region. The people of Rojava have been one of the United States' most effective allies in fighting ISIS. Today is World Rojava Day. All across the globe, thousands of people have protested Turkey's brutal assault on the region and the United States' betrayal of the Kurdish people. In yesterday's Guardian, there was an op-ed from a dozen social movement leaders and indigenous leaders calling for solidarity with Rojava. The words of the movement leaders offer a far better introduction to our forum than I can. Here's what they wrote. What is at stake in northeast Syria is more than the fate of the Kurdish people or the autonomous homeland of Rojava or even the fight against ISIS. What is at stake is humanity's ability to survive our current civilization crisis and to imagine new alternatives before it's too late. Turkish Prime Minister Erdogan's brutal invasion of Rojava is using 20th century techniques of extreme violence and genocide despite a proclaimed ceasefire. Turkey's Air Force is raining down napalm and white phosphorus on innocent civilians. At the same time, jihadi squads are massacring fleeing civilians as retribution for Rojava's fight against ISIS, and their role as arguably the most important ally to the West in the region. The US, the UK, France, Russia, and other alleged superpowers are actively betraying both international law and the Geneva Convention by allowing and facilitating the ethnic cleansing and occupation of Rojava. Turkey's aim is clear: to eradicate what all fascist powers fear most, a free people daring to create brave and successful experiments outside the globalized extractive system. Since 2012, around 5 million people, Kurds, Arabs, Assyrians, Turkmen, Yazidis, and others, have built the autonomous region of Rojava, demonstrating how a multi-ethnic society can respectfully coexist beyond the constraints of nation-state, patriarchy, and capitalism. By promoting radically democratic and decentralized self-governance, equity between genders, regenerative agriculture, a justice system based on reconciliation and inclusion of minorities, the Rojava experiment has presented a living example of possibility under the most impossible of circumstances. We encourage readers to review the Rojava Charter of Social Contract for inspiration. Western leaders are feigning empathy with Armenian, German, feigning empathy while American, German, and British weapon manufacturers are actively selling weapons to Turkey. It is clear that the dominant system cannot and will not defend those seeking to explore other ways of knowing and being. As the imprisoned Turkish leader Abdullah Öcalan writes, "The real power of capitalist modernity isn't its money and its weapons, but its ability to suffocate all utopias with its liberalism." However, a growing chorus of allies are rising up around the world. From Haiti to Lebanon, from Chile to Iraq, from Cameroon to the United States, from the UK to Hong Kong, social revolutions are confronting the rise of fascism, short-termism, greed, climate destruction, and warfare that are required to prop up our existing economic paradigm. The battle lines are becoming clearer: domination versus cooperation, colonization versus autonomy, oppression versus freedom, patriarchy versus partnership. These values are the warp and weft of the defining struggle for the future of humanity. For Rojava to survive and for justice to truly prevail, those rising up in their local context must stand together creatively with shared voice, values, and vision for global systems change. Rojava is fighting for the same reasons as the awakening majority from around the world. It has shown that the way out of social and ecological crisis is not through GDP-focused development, but rather with decentralized, autonomous communities. Making such communities work is in more and more places by regenerating ecosystems, healing our collective trauma, and creating social structures of solidarity and trust is the transformational work of our times. Once we see our struggles as inherently interdependent with each other and with the web of life itself, no army on the planet will be able to stop the inevitable transition. As leaders from social movements, communities, and First Nations from around the world, we stand in solidarity with the vision and work of Rojava. We pray for their resilience, protection, and perseverance. We pray that we will listen to and learn from the living earth as she continues to show us how to create societies which live in cooperation with all beings. We pray that those in positions of power be reminded of their humanity and end this invasion immediately. Tonight's forum will feature two speakers. After they have both spoken, there will be a period of dialogue between myself and the panelists, followed by an opportunity for questions from the floor. Dr. Hejar Oncel was born and raised in the Rojava region. He reports growing up in a politically active family that gave him the opportunity to observe the evolution of the three main pillars of the Kurdish freedom movement: socially and economically democratic nation, absolute gender equality, and ecological society. He earned a Ph.D. in mechanical engineering from the University of Houston and an MBA from UC Berkeley. Dr. Paula Pineda is a comparative political scientist with research expertise in decentralization and ethnic conflict. She earned a Ph.D. in political science and government from the University of Houston. She says, "Kurdish politics is a primary case of the inspiration for my work." She currently leads economic development for the city of Houston, focusing on small business and workforce development. Unfortunately, our third speaker for the evening, Joshua Washburn, had a family emergency and is unable to join us. Before we begin, I would like to invite you now into a moment of silence. Let us collectively pause to honor the memory of all of those who died defending Rojava, all the people who've been killed by military violence, and all of those who have been victims of terrorism and state violence in Northern Syria and elsewhere. Let us sit in silence for a minute and hold them in our hearts. Amen. I invite you now to give a warm round of welcome to our panelists.
Lately, you've been seeing Kurds all the time on the news, and for all the very sad reasons. But I just wanted to start my speech with something interesting and that may make you laugh. I was just reading a newspaper, and it was mentioning how this American journalist went to Kobani and found a Trump restaurant, went to Erbil and found a child that was named George Bush, went to another town that found a child that was named Barack Obama, and funny enough, a YPG fighter named her daughter that was born 2 weeks ago, America. Who are these Kurds? Why do they love America so much? And what bonds us together? I'm a Kurd, 7,000 miles away, and I grew up always loving America. I heard a lot of stories of betrayal from my uncles and parents, but somehow there's this love. And why? I always ask that question to myself. And I think what we want as Kurds is not any different than what George Washington and Thomas Jefferson wanted for Americans. And what we want is nothing different than what's written in the Declaration of Independence or Declaration of Human Rights. We don't want anything more or less than that. And I think that whole similarities between ideals that we stand for, the values that we have, is what connects Kurds to Americans. But there are some differences as well. And here's one. The general that commands the Syrian Democratic Forces, his name is Muslim Kobani. Talking to Trump, talking to Putin, interesting fellow. His first name, Muslim, is a very common Kurdish name. It means oppressed, downtrodden, aggrieved. Would you ever give that name to your children in America? I don't think so. There must be some very difficult history for these people that they actually cherish such a name. His last name, Kobani, it stands for the town in 2014 where Kurds showed to our American allies that we will fight to death to stand against Islamofascism. And we have the willpower to fight against ISIS on behalf of humanity. And that's when America came to our help. And that's when it started in 2014. But since then, we lost 11,000 people. Almost 100,000 people have been injured. Hundreds of towns were destroyed. And we are on the verge of imminent ethnic cleansing on the historic lands that we have been living. Such as my family have been in the same area for 500 years, and we may have to be displaced. And this is not very easy to understand unless you really grow up there. But I will try to make it easy for you tonight. So I just want to go a little bit into what does Rojava mean. Rojava in Kurdish means just west, because after World War I, Kurdistan was divided into 5 parts. And Rojava, the westernmost part, stayed under the French control, which became Syria. We have Roshalat, which means east, that's the Iranian part. We have the northern Kurdistan, which is today's Turkey, and southern Kurdistan, which is Iraq, and we also have Kurds living in post-Soviet countries in the Caucasus region. So we all have different passports, and more than 1 million of us in Syria don't even have passport. We are stateless. And we have a lot of divisions among us as well. Linguistically, we speak 5 different dialects that are semi-intelligible. Religiously, we have Yazidis, Yaresanis, Muslims, Jews, Christians, atheists. Politically, it's an alphabet soup. Multiple groups. Sometimes even I am having a hard time to understand, which group is which. And I wouldn't even expect anybody to go into all these details. But I think what's most important is what defines us and what unites us. One is a very difficult history. In 1926, British used the chemical bombs against the Kurds in Iraq. In 1988, Saddam Hussein used the chemical bombs against Kurds in Iraq. In Iran, same story. And Colin just mentioned it's being used even today. I don't want to go into any of the details of the difficult history, but that's definitely what bonds us. Because just being born as a Kurd is almost having a shirt in fire and you put it on and you cannot take it off all your life. But most important thing, I think, is our way of life and our aspirations, is what differs us from our neighbors and what connects us with Americans. And I would like to go a little bit into more details in that. In a lot of weddings in Kurdistan, you will see men and women together dancing. To an American ear, that's not progressive. But in a neighborhood where men and women are strictly enforced to live in separate quadrants of the houses, men and women dancing together is the main reason why ISIS called us apostates, infidels, worth to kill. And we are proud of it. We cherish that because that's what differentiates us, that whole egalitarian aspect of life. We still live, I would say, a post-tribal lifestyle where we have this connection with the nature and environment that we're living in, a little bit similar to Native Americans here, and we cherish that as well. And hence, that brings up the three main pillars of the Kurdish movement that really took root. And it's not any different than common Western values that bind Europe to North America. It starts with number one, the democratic nation. And why does democracy mean so much to Kurds, which has very low literacy rates, not that educated, not many intellectuals, but one of the fervent people that is ready to die and fight for democracy? And how did we come to realization that democracy is so important? Unfortunately, we don't have amazing institutions that teach us all these things, but life taught us. We realized that if we want to express ourselves as Kurds, and we are minorities in all the countries that was created after World War I, all these countries need to adhere to democracy to give us an avenue to express ourselves and to be a part of life there. The value of democracy is measured by which it treats its minorities. And I know even America has its own difficult history, but it reached a level where we Kurds look at and we aspire to reach that level in the countries that we live in. We don't want that just for ourselves. We want that actually for the majority groups, the majority ethnicities that we're sharing the countries with. We want that for Turks. We want that for Arabs. We want that for Persians. We want that for Jews. We want a democratic, multicultural Middle East. But we also want the right to express ourselves as Kurds, as a distinct group that is respected, an equal member of the United Community of the Nations. An important element in our movement, actually, which flourished in Rojava, which surprised a lot of academics, was the whole adherence to bottom-up society building. Not a top-down nation building, which actually how a lot of Western countries have been built. We experimented something that nobody else has ever experimented. We looked up the West, we understood what West achieved, we understood what was the problem in the Western world today. So we wanted to make an experiment that was even a leap forward for Western thinkers. Hence, we Kurds in the countries we live in, be it Syria, Iraq, Iran, our goal is not just to create a separate nation state and then pursue that and fight for it and simple ethno-nationalism, no. What we want is actually to create a society that respects differences, that organizes bottom-up, that makes sure that the people at the bottom of the society has a way to express themselves and the entire society built on that layer. And then what does that mean? That means that it's not only for Kurds and for other ethnic groups, but it's also for every person with different sexual orientation, different gender, different looks, different skin color. We want that to be inclusive. The second pillar of our movement is gender equality, and absolute gender equality. In Rojava today, every single decision-making position needs to consist of a man and a woman. That includes the military structure. The very interesting detail that a lot of people don't talk about, a co-chairman cannot veto a co-chairwoman's decision. A co-chairwoman has the right to veto co-chairman's decision.
Cheers.
This is our affirmative action in place. In an area where women were condemned to wear burqa and were not allowed to go to grocery store on their own without the permission of their son or husband. So imagine the differences between the neighborhood we are living in and the society we want to build. Hence the importance of Rojava, and hence to the point of calling, it's not just ethnic cleansing, it's not just one ethnic group fighting for its rights. It's good, it's a bright future fighting against evil. That's how I see it. And I would like to also add that if women take up arms, if mothers take up arms, that should tell us something. If a mother sees the opportunity for her child, for a potential bright future, she will take every risk. If a woman is ready to die or kill, that means there is no other option for survival. And that's what Kurds are standing for right now. That's the main reason why our beautiful girls, our mothers, even the grandmothers had to take up arms against the evil of ISIS for survival, and that we had no other option. Our women understood that, and that's why they took up arms. And the moment our neighborhood reaches the state of a multicultural, accepting society, then there's no reason for anybody to take up arms and do that. But unfortunately, there are the realities of the region. And hence, we have YPJ, which is a women-only army, which has two goals: protecting the people of Rojava and fighting for feminism. In the neighborhood where ISIS was ruling 2 years ago. The third pillar of our movement is ecological society. And one can think, wow, they are trying to survive in a neighborhood which is very difficult and they care about sustainability and ecology. That's a little bit suspicious. I think they're just paying lip service. Opposite. For Kurds, for our survival, ecology plays an important role. Number one is the militaries of the oppressing countries around us are number one culprits of the deforestation. They are burning the forests in Kurdistan so that they can control the region with their tanks or planes or helicopters. And I would like to underline that Kurdistan has the highest percentage of water on its land, and it's the greenest part of the Middle East. Number two, the dams that they are building is just to choke each other's nation states, such as the ones built in Turkey, so the water is controlled against Iraq and Syria as a political weapon. And another reason that the dams are built, it's basically they're creating little islands between the dams where they can depopulate and, based on their term, de-Kurdify and Arabize or Turkify or Persianize. Create those little islands, attack, change the ethnic constitution. And they call this ethnic engineering. And the water problem in the Middle East is obvious. 2004 to 2011, 7 years of drought in Syria was one of the main drivers of the civil war. And in Iran, you may all remember how Prime Minister Netanyahu was offering a cup of water to Iranians because of the water problem in Iran. And all these, unfortunately, are man-made water problems. And we understand that if we don't find a solution to that, that will be first the extermination of the Kurds, but then extermination of humanity. But unfortunately, we are in line number one. We're going to be the first one to be exterminated. We understand that we have to address that problem as well. And overall, we call that whole understanding of the democratic nation, absolute gender equality, and ecological society, we call it democratic confederalism, where differences live, coexist, and cherish each other and enrich each other. And then finally, I will touch the topic of our aspirations as Kurds. We want to be the champions of transformation in a region, unfortunately, that keep electing, freely electing, leaders with dictatorial tendencies. Unfortunately, but it's the part of truth. Majority of Persians are happy with the regime, majority of the Turks are happy with the regime, and majority of the Arabs supported the regimes. This is very unfortunate. So we realize that this is not a war that we can win with guns. We have to win the hearts and minds, like American generals always say, hearts and minds of the people. We have to change their opinion. We have to make them think in a democratic and accepting way, despite their prejudices. Otherwise, we cannot win this war. So this is not war that we are fighting just on the battlefield. I think the most important one is the one that we are fighting in the minds of the ethnic groups that are constituting the majority in the Middle East. And for that reason, and for the very simplicity of our movement's main tenets, you see Jews, devout Christians, Yazidis, atheists, capitalists, communists, anarchists, Republicans, Democrats, French, Italian, Australian, British volunteers supporting, donating, living with us, fighting and dying with us. That should be such a simple appeal to people that is attractive to so many people with such different backgrounds. And I think the reason we are being attacked today by all the people that worship not any religion, they all worship power and their imperial goals, it's because we cherish life. It's because we cherish humanity and being human. We cherish differences. We cherish our commonalities. I'll give you one example. New York Times was citing that their correspondent from Beirut was surprised how the judicial process of ex-ISIS fighters, how forgiving they were in Kurdish region in Syria, in Rojava. And they were literally giving them hope for a better life. Only if they read books that cherish all the values that I told you, and they are ready to commit the rest of their life to community service. I'm talking about jihadi thugs that killed people, that caused such mayhem. And these people, if we see that we can cure them and we can take them back to society, we can forgive them, because this is the society we want to create. But unfortunately, the powers that are trying to choke and exterminate us, they are preaching and praising death. They are representing what I call their rapist regimes. What they stand for is not any religion or any political standing. What they stand for is simply destruction, is simply genocidal intents of not accepting differences. And at its core, it's anti-Western, and it's a big danger for America, for the West, for Europe, and for Kurds. So I would like to finish my thoughts with saying that if George Washington were to live now, probably all the regimes in the Middle East would have called him a terrorist, that is trying to incite people against their governments. And I will say, founding fathers are our compass as Kurds, and we are going to follow them. Thank you.
Hello, can y'all hear me? Good evening. I also have a funny story from when I was in Kurdistan, Iraqi Kurdistan. I went to a hair salon. One was for women, one was for men, and I just thought it was so funny that the men's hair salon had 40, thank you, sir, 40 images of George Clooney plastered on the walls as the model that anyone, any man walking into the barbershop can aspire to look like. They love George Clooney, and I love George Clooney, so I thought that was a nice appearance. And I have another story. I met a lady that we were talking about the city of Mardin, a Kurdish city in Turkey. Beautiful city. If you want to go on a trip that is non-touristy to a beautiful gem of multiple layers of ancient Middle Eastern culture, write this down, Mardin. It is the pearl of the Middle East, M-A-R-D-I-N. I was not paid for this statement. I'm just watching out for you. And in that town, I was with some friends, and we stopped by at a gas station to get gas, and we saw a Kurdish wedding that was taking place, and I said, wow, that looks like so much fun. And so my Kurdish friend said, let's go. And so we crashed the Kurdish wedding, and we were super welcome, and I learned how to dance halai. And it's something that always stands out to me as a fun moment, but such a demonstration of Kurdish hospitality, extreme Kurdish hospitality. I'm getting married, come by, I don't know you, but you're welcome. And here's delicious food. So those are fun memories that I have of the beautiful aspects of this interesting topic that is the Kurdish issue. And then as Hejar, alluded to, and I'm sure that as interested parties, there's a lot of sadness. And so in my dissertation dedication, I alluded to the very common, very sad, how common it is, Kurdish idiom that even small children, 5 years old, know, and that is, the Kurds have no friends but the mountains. And I know that we were going to have a speaker here who volunteered in a military capacity as a fighter, and that reminded me of some of our own American soldiers that have lamented recent actions or lack of action to support the Kurds as our allies. And once again, making the echo of that idiom reverberate in the region. And it's sad that I wasn't it's sad that I wasn't surprised. So I have a whole publication on how that could have been expected, actually, out of a foreign policy. So I'm actually also very curious about you all, because it's a Saturday night and you have convened here, and so I can shape my comments where I have this obsession with decentralization. I have research expertise in ethnic conflict and institutions, and I've applied a lot of that to the Kurds. But why are you here? And I'm wondering, if you could just raise your hands, who is here because they're interested in feminist issues? Yes, okay. Who is here because, and I thank you for your service, because you've served in the military and that kind of connects to you, or you have an interest in the military aspects of this topic? Ooh, very pacifist group. Okay. Who is here out of an interest in the democratic principles that Rojava really stands for? I felt it in my bones. I love it. And especially those people who's concerned about the erosion of democracy, perhaps closer to home. Yeah, okay. And I appreciate that because I'm a scholar in institutions, right? And that's really what I see. There's so many beautiful things about this narrative and Kurdish people. But in my work, it's the institutions that appeal to me. And so let me see if I can tailor some of my comments and frameworks to your interests. So let's talk about the feminist cause. So Hejar mentioned the implementation in Rojava of female participation and representation. And this is so interesting, not only in the context of the Middle East at large, but actually in comparison Kurd to Kurd. And I say that because if you go to Iraqi Kurdistan, I was there in 2015, capital, Erbil and Kurdish Hejar. There's a strong, deep, prevalent practice still of tribalism. And this tribalism is what really has a lot of implications for the female rights and issues. And it was very surprising to me to see things like FGM, the female genital mutilation, still kind of present. And they're Kurds, and that's a Kurdish issue. But then we see in Rojava that there's a complete eradication of all of these types of practices with the use of the institutions. And so we have, you know, a people really taking different approaches to the gender issue with the tool of the institutions. And so in these communes where they've built in Rojava 50% female representation, they get to vote on matters of justice for themselves. And so where in the rest of the Middle East, a woman who has been committed of adultery, for example, most likely erroneously, right, because it can be by word of mouth or jealous ex-lover, right? I'd be screwed. You know, they instituted a system that replaces Sharia law, and it says that we kind of set up a jury in this commune, and we decide based on certain principles, judicial principles, your fate. And so they have changed the tradition that is so ancient, the religious tradition of meting out justice, with an actual judicial, transparent, community-based institution. And so we see the eradication of a lot of those practices in such a short time. For me, that is the most uplifting part of it. I mean, they've been there 5 years, and they've been able to really attack and eliminate in their jurisdiction these practices that have prevailed in the region across religion. It's really not a Muslim thing, across ethnicity. It's a tribal thing. We see it in Africa. We see it in ancient Ethiopia. It's everywhere that tribalism had a foothold. In 5 years. What? That is an amazing accomplishment, and it speaks to the power of institutions that prioritize representation. That's the key, right? So when we were here in Houston celebrating 9 Black judicial members in our courts, judges, right, in our courts, that's the same thing. It's the active representation of a person, whether it's a minority, whether it's a woman, and in many cases around the world when you're both a minority and a woman, right, and you have that intersectionality of double difficulty, that this tool really reveals its power. So yay for institutions and their ability to affect radical change. And one of my frustrations working for city government is the length of time that it takes to change things, right? I've almost gotten fired so many times. And so our government in the US is designed to change slowly. But I think that it's so effective in perpetuating representation once it can be achieved, that it's worth pursuing. In the case of Rojava, reveals that, right? So when it comes to our concerns about female representation in the US, the most important mechanism is, well, what institutions are are in place and how many women are in it, right? Whether it's Congress, whether it's the local health regional office. How many female doctors are in that office, right? So all the research demonstrates the power of representation at every level in policy decision-making. Whether we want to admit it or not, statistically controlling for all other factors, if a woman goes to a lending institution, which in general, in business, for example, I work in small business now, doesn't tend to rule or decide in favor of women, but if it's a woman in that place, it's going to be more favorable. Same thing goes for minorities. So these Kurdish women in Rojava who have a jury-like style assembly in their commune to decide their case about, adultery and whatnot, they are receiving more justice because of the higher representation that's around them in these systems that have been put in place that are highly, highly representative, 50% required, right? So that's that topic. When it comes to democracy, I mean, the beautiful thing about Rojava is I think it's the aspiration. I love the word Hejar used. It's an aspiration, right? We keep going towards it. And that's what America is. I'm an immigrant. I moved here from Chile when I was a little girl. And one of the beautiful things that I've experienced is I'm Latin, and no one has ever told me, don't speak in Spanish. And I understand that we've seen in the news some recent revelations that that's not kind of everywhere. But in general, I was allowed to peacefully coexist here with everyone in Houston, expressing myself as an American and a Latin woman and Chilean. And it's not threatening. They're not mutually exclusive concepts. We can have multiple identities, and those may be fluid, right? If someone had the audacity to tell me not to speak in Spanish, I might just start getting real into Spanish, right? It's very fluid and it can be provoked. And so, when we think about Rojava, it's an aspiration in this practice of respecting the dignity and the identity. And the literature says that the recognition of identity is one of the most powerful things. You don't even have to do much after that. But the fact that I, as a Kurd, now that we've formed Iraqi Kurdistan, can say I'm a Kurd, so powerful. And that's what Kurds in Turkey we're dying to be able to say, and we're going to jail to be able to say, I am Kurdish. Yes?
I just want to add, you will remember how President Trump called one of the journalists Mr. Kurd. I don't know if you remember that incident. It's not an incident, actually. A lot of press corps was standing there, and President Trump wanted to just said, Mr. Kurd, can I hear your question? And for American ears, that was an insult. You don't even know my last name or my name or who do I work for. But this person said, I want to actually change my last name to Kurd after President called me because I am 45, and in Iraq I was always ashamed and I was always looked down, and the president of the superpower called me Mr. Kurd. I take it as a token of appreciation and acceptance. So, sorry. No, it's just where we're coming from, and then that whole sensitivity has changed. Yeah. Please go ahead.
No, perfect example. So recognition is key, right? So when we're considering American democracy, how many groups are fighting still the way the Kurds are around the world in their respective countries to be able to say, I am Kurd? To be able to say my grandmother is Kurd living in Diyarbakir in eastern Turkey. She actually only speaks Kurdish. Her Turkish is kind of bad, right? The way some immigrant generations here would say, dang, my mom's English isn't good. Same thing. And yet, if a charge is brought against her and she has to go to Turkish court and she dares to say anything in Kurdish, she goes to jail. Right? And so the recognition of who you are, who you say you are, it's self-defined, is so important. And so if in Rojava, the aspiration is to say, hey, most of us are Kurds, but, you're Arab, cool. You are LGBTQ, You are Jew, you are welcome here from, Finland, like all these people that are just coming. And everybody is welcome, and everybody's self-perpetuated identity is recognized. This is huge. And how amazing that this is just the practice automatically in this kind of experimental democratic state, right? That hasn't been appointed as a nation, but it's seized kind of autonomous power and governance. How amazing that it just implemented that so easily, and people die in so many countries as a minority just seeking the same recognition that was so automatically given there. So to me, as a scholar of ethnic conflict, minority politics, and all these wars that ravage countries based on ethnicity, the automatic implementation of recognition in Rojava is a global model of true democracy when we think about representation. And when we think about the erosion or the continued trajectory of American democracy, right, as a continuous aspiration that for most of us has yet to be fully realized, and maybe will never be fully realized, right? It's an aspiration. That's one important aspect, because we are so multicultural, multi-faith. To be American isn't to be actually Christian, Irish, black, white. It's to aspire to a set of values that is the only thing actually that unites us along all these kind of multiple identities, and many of us layers of identities, right? I consider myself Christian and Native American and of Irish descent, and libertarian, all these layers of identity. And that's a beautiful thing. And wherever in the U.S. it's unacceptable to do that and to express that, and where that recognition is not given, is a failure of democracy. And that's what I think is one of the sad things about, the Rojava example kind of being threatened right now, is that it really serves as a global, what was it, the city on the hill that the Puritans wanted to be? We are like upon a city upon a hill, right? That aspirational character of a society that is the dream. Everybody's welcome, everybody works hard. We're all equal to one another, and that's what we see institutionalized, because you may be a grandfather living in Rojava that isn't so comfortable with this system in the commune of 50% women. What? This is not what it was when I grew up. But you want to live here? These are the rules. And that's the power of institution. That's the power of institution. I think we can just take questions.
I'll just like to add one interesting example to what she was saying. When the town of El-Shaddadi fell into the hands of taken back from Daesh, from ISIS, the first thing that happened, basically, our female fighters went into the town, liberated it, and then they made an announcement that now the city needs to choose a co-mayor, a co-governor for the town, a female one, right? So and they gave them 24 hours to decide, and then the next day, a lot of men were out in the streets and no women was out there. So, and you are living in this neighborhood, you're trying to get 50% quota at every decision-making position, and you need to implement it, right? So what they did, our girls went with their AK-47s to every single door, knock on the door, and said, "Where are the women?" They took the women out, and they invited them to the school, and they said, "We want to see every single woman in this town in the school building in 2 hours." And then all the women went there, and it was women-only conversation, and they decided who's going to be actually representing them. And here you go. From ISIS rule to 50% women quota in 24 hours. Naturally, one can claim that, well, they used violence, this is not acceptable, but the neighborhood you're living in sometimes requires such dramatic methods. So I just wanted to bring that to light, and that's how you sometimes achieve the speed in people's minds. You sometimes force them to choose somebody, and then they will learn how to choose.
And actually, one last point from the institutional perspective for those interested in the democratic principles. In Rojava, The smallest unit of government is the most active. This is the dream of decentralization, my people, okay? They have communes that constitute 30 to about 200 households. So it's as if every neighborhood association in Houston was convening all the time to decide on everything. And you know, you on the one hand, we think, wow, that just sounds really time consuming. But on the other hand, what an active participation in society that is, right? And so when people stress about the erosion of American democracy, part of it is because there's an erosion of participation in democracy. We have local elections coming up next week. How many people just don't vote in the local elections that are literally the elections that decide, you know, our streets, our schools, our so many of the issues that touch our daily life, right? But we're competing against, you know, it's cold. I understand. I hate the cold weather, even though I'm Chilean, and I'm supposed to embrace it. You know, I have a video game. I can watch the series on Netflix. Whatever your vices, right? We all have them. And so that's a cost-benefits analysis of my time. Do I want to spend it utilizing my democratic right to vote, or am I actually so secure that I have it that I don't really care to exercise it too much? Thereby, decisions are made over me all the time. And so the people in Rojava, you know, they've decided to participate. The last that I've heard from sources on the ground is that's not like a forced participation. I mean, they are happy, maybe because of the context, you know, where that was never the case before, that what? I can go voice my opinion. What? This person that will represent me has to go and tell the General Aggregate Council and has to come back to me for my feedback before going back? What? Right? So, you know, when we talk about the practice of democracy and how relevant representation is, active participation is the other side of the coin of that. And so another commendable aspect of the Kurds and what they're doing in Rojava is they're participating in the institutions and the systems and the processes and the communes that they've set up.
I think we'd be happy to take questions from the floor. Jahan is volunteered to run around with a microphone, and I think I'll recognize people just so it's a little orderly. So
Hello.
if we could start with, I don't know your name, but there.
Women first, of course. So what happened 5 years ago, and what are these institutions? And you mentioned communes, and why do we not know anything about this?
Okay, I'll start and jump in.
Please.
So what happened 5 years ago is that the Syrian Kurds established this confederalism, democratic confederalism, in northern Syria, in the territory that is known as Rojava. And it was really an interesting development for, you know, kind of political science and legal scholars, because there was really just a power vacuum. And they decided, no one's here, Assad's not bothering, let's just go in here. And they set up like a whole society. And they drew, because of their affiliation with these ideals that Hejar so nicely outlined, right? Drawn from Abdullah Öcalan, who actually drew from some of the anarchist and democratic kind of theories from what's his name in New York?
Murray Bookchin from Vermont actually is the #1 inspiration for the Kurdish movement.
Yes.
And I believe he has less than 1,000 readers in America. In my hometown, only 20,000 people are reading his books right now. So it starts in America, comes to Kurdistan, it sticks more in Kurdistan.
Yeah. So look that up. And then, and so, you know, Abdullah Öcalan has been a contested head of the PKK in Turkey for so long. He's in jail. And I think in jail, he really just fleshed out his theories, right? And so it's almost as if the opportunity arose, this vacuum space opened up, and they decided to literally set up this dream society that all the songs, the Kurdistan songs have been about, the movies have been about, the secret conversations hiding from, from what I know from my friends in Turkey. Literally, you want to talk about these topics in hiding, right? Very Weimar Republic. They set it up, and they set it up in such a beautifully non-elitist way. I mean, it is the only kind of structure I've seen in my research and in my work where it's not a setup of, yes, this is democracy, and, we, 80% of the profits go for me, that kind of setup of kind of kickbacks. I mean, it is very egalitarian. There's no weight of voices at any level. It's all the votes. And again, I stress that the key is the power of the communes, because this is a comparative contrast. Iraqi Kurdistan, which was celebrated for finally achieving autonomy, the Kurds got it. They're their own autonomous state. Everybody that was Kurd around the world celebrated for Iraqi Kurdistan. Finally, Kurdistan is becoming a reality. We have our own place. Barzani, the leader. The sad thing is, within this free Kurdish autonomous state, there's very little local level, and they weren't very happy when I went over there and told them this, right, in an academic presentation. Why don't you have local elections? Why is Barzani and the tribes, why are they appointing the mayors? And why haven't been changed in 10 years, right? And so it's so interesting how the irony of having had reached this level of autonomy from the rest of Iraq, but when it comes to kind of the inside of what is happening still in Iraqi Kurdistan is not very democratic compared to Rojava, where there is no single one person that dominates Rojava. There is no single, group of political elites that dominates and profits from Rojava. I mean, it's really the dream. It's really the dream.
I think it's a little similar to the principles that Founding Father put together, and then you have seen different things in Jim Crow, right? And then you have seen different implementation in Mississippi, California, and Utah. It's the same. Kurds have very similar aspirations of these goals, but implementation, unfortunately, is different from country to country. Yeah.
And so for the female question, right? Part of that setup, because that was the second principle of the three that Hejar so nicely outlined. I mean, it's crucial to the movement, right? And when I say the movement, I mean kind of this PKK-oriented ideology led by Abdullah Öcalan. Automatically, women have to have 50% of this, 50% of this at every assembly, 50%, and the veto powers that he alluded to. So, it was just set in from the very beginning, to the complete contrast of everyone around them.
I think our next question was from over there.
Yeah, I'd like to get a little clarification as to what a Kurd is. Correct me if I'm wrong. You refer to Christians who live in Kurdish areas, Jews who live in Kurdish areas, Buddhists maybe who live in, Democrats and Republicans, as you outlined. It appears to me that the definition of a Kurd is somebody who comes from a geographical area that at one time was part of the Ottoman Empire, and after the First World War was split up into I think you said 4 or 5 different areas. And they were attached to Turkey, Syria, Iraq, or wherever. And that the motivation is to reunite as a geographical area. That a Kurd is not a religion per se. It's a geographical identification of people who want to live under certain governing principles that they feel are reasonable and live their lives that way. Is that correct?
There's a lot of truth in what you said. I will just elaborate a little more. Kurd in itself is an ethnicity, in a sense that Median Empire, which precedes, I don't know if you're interested in history, which precedes the Persian Empire, that in the what we call Kurdistan today, there was an empire called Median Empire. In that area, always tribal confederations that lived were called Kirti, Korduene, Gorduene, Mitsanni. Those are all ancestors of Kurds that were living in that area. But one important thing that we need to note is that that area is where humanity started, right? The Caucasus Mountains, that's why Europeans are called Caucasians, right? Because all the Europeans migrated from the Caucasus area. So Kurdistan region was basically on the way of every migrating group. That's why, as you elaborated, even though the starting point is actually some tribes that were living there 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, and actually that started the agricultural revolution, whoever came up later, they also assimilated into this idea of being Kurdistani, from that land. That's why today you can find blue-eyed Kurds, blonde Kurds, dark Kurds, short Kurds. If you go to Kurdistan, you're like, those guys don't look like each other, but they claim to be from the same tribe. They claim to be married to their very close tribes, but they don't look like each other. And hence, exactly what you elaborated. It started off a small ethnic group, but whoever came and settled there took up that identity.
Do we have other questions from the floor? Okay, so, yeah.
I was just going to ask, is democratic confederalism possible here, right now? Like, can we do something, not just to aid Rojava and be solidaritist, but actually enact democratic confederalism here, now? Is that a possible thing? Has anyone seen, or?
Sure. Good question. Good question, and I hope you're going to become a
the question
federal
was,
scholar.
Can we enact democratic confederalism here in the United States? Sorry.
That is a beautiful question, just waiting to become a dissertation. If you need an advisor, I got you. Okay. Yes, so, confederalism, federalism, decentralization, these are all the lexicon of this research and academic area called decentralization, okay? And so the U.S., the most common measure of decentralization is a federal structure as opposed to a unitary structure. The U.S., like Switzerland, is a federal structure. Now, part of my dissertation was, what do we talk about when we talk about decentralization? Because we may be federal in nature and say we are the United States, and every state decides itself what it wants to do, and we have elements of that, right? It's a complex kind of reality, but at the same time we have very highly centralized interjections, right? So in education policy, for example, the education dollars that are sent by the Department of Education, a federal level, are sent to the states with a mandate. And that per se really undermines what is this bottom-up approach that is what decentralization is supposed to be. Because why are you giving me funds and telling me what to do with them? So in that case, I'm spending the funds, so I have autonomy over the funds, but if I don't have autonomy over how I spend them, is that really autonomy, right? So I think your question is so interesting and so good because it speaks to, the U.S.'s kind of nature and aspiration as a federal state, and then the reality on the ground. And so I really, if the question is how can we be more like Rojava, then I would say we would have to enhance decentralization. And you can go about that in two ways. You can say, hey, federal government, we need to change this legislation so that federal funding doesn't come with a mandate. That might take a minute. Or two, you can say, well, what can we do today and now? This is why I left academia to go into government, right? To do something besides write journal articles. Sometimes I felt that I was providing a solution that wasn't taken. And so what can we do today? We can say, well, let's bolster the avenues for our voice at the local level wherever we can. So that means in context of education, I need to go to that school board meeting and be very aware of who's about to be voted to be the lead of that. Because that's going to be the person that really dictates a lot of the educational policy that touches our students. And who do I want that to be? Right? And what kind of pressure can we put on that person by attending board meetings and other public kind of platforms that school districts and such put on, and 3 people show up, and those 3 people vote, and so whoever gets in, you know? And so really, I think if we wanted to become more like Rojava with the structures and institutions that we have in place, we can start by participating more, voicing our opinion more. Sometimes I really think just out of gratitude that we have that avenue, you know, and we don't even use it. And then for the long term, if you have the patience, you know, from the top down, you know, we can become like radical decentralizationists instead of anarchists, and, you know, join together and change the nature of decentralization in the U.S. You know, I'd join that club. But that's a longer term vision, and there's a lot we can do today.
I'm just going to add a few things, just very short. One is Murray Bookchin and Noam Chomsky are the 2 inspirational people for the Kurdish movement. So this was written by Americans, for America. We just took that model and implemented it in Rojava, so it should be implementable here. And number 2, like Paula said, vacuum is very important. If there is a power vacuum, if there is any loophole, especially when you think of it from the community side, it's easy to start building up communes when you have people that actually believe in that bottom-up societal organization will work. And I think if it will work anywhere, that will be probably America. Yeah.
So we had another question there.
I think it's worth, yeah, there we go. So it's something you alluded to earlier with the very low participation that we have in like local democracy, electoral. One of the crushing things that I've been through was witnessing the complete divide between radical militant and then radicals involved in electoral process. You know, lately over the last few years, that's gotten even more severe. But also, I just got to Houston a couple of months ago, and if you knew any outlets to help organize through, to participate in maybe organizing actions, or in the simplest forms, being able to organize with the help.
Well, first I commend you because you're very young and very interested in participation, and you're not out there playing a video game, so that's cool.
I do both.
Yeah, well, you can do both. Look at that. So 2, can you first clarify what you mean by this thing that dismayed you about seeing militant, something with the voting polls, something?
Yeah, over the last couple of years, it's actually started to turn violent.
What has?
Oh, and between radical militant and then the radicals or the activists trying to be involved with the democratic process. I think anybody in the DSA could clarify that. Okay. But over the last couple of years, between a faction called the Red Guard and then the Democratic Socialists for America, there's just been this complete divide, and with what I'm hearing from them, it's been a big benefit is having the radicals actually participating, you know, in the electoral process.
Yes. So, you know, there's this, and feel free to chime in if I'm not understanding you well, but, you know, there's this kind of ideology that by principle says, you know, because the current structure doesn't allow for our ideology to be in place, we're not going to participate in it. And so I won't vote and I won't do all of this, which is, you know, I understand the principle to kind of boycott, right? And then contrasted with the violence, I guess, of kind of trying to influence who people vote for and whether or not they vote. Is that what you're alluding to?
Yes.
Okay.
So it's like people like the Democratic Socialists for America, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, these people that are participating to really push.
Yep.
And from what I'm hearing from them, it's actually having the radicals participating in democracy that's been a big benefit. And I was just explaining, it's been crushing to witness the divide that's continued to grow between kind of radical, anarchist, militant, anti-fascist, and the divide from that to those trying to participate in the electoral process.
Okay.
And it's something I've witnessed that I think has been really devastating for us.
Yes.
I mean, I'll just make one comment, because we Kurds tried almost every way to be a part of a society that we were living in, right? Like, there were people that tried democracy, people tried violence and every different method, and all I can tell is you need to find the most viable solution in the system you are living in, and we Kurds understood that the best method to come to a conclusion is basically to talk to everybody, even if you see them as the main reason of the oppression, even if they have their ideology is preaching our extermination. We realize that we have to talk with them, and the only way to talk with people is to engage them in a democratic process as much as the system allows. So that's my belief. Democratic processes, especially in Western world, allows any kind of possible change, and we came to that realization, and we are only raising up arms when it's extremely necessary, like in the case of fighting an enemy like ISIS. Other than that, I think divisions and any other militant method will create nothing but mayhem and a terrible end for everybody that is engaged in it.
And then the other thing, after this, if anybody knows any organizations to help organize through,
Yep.
because like I said, I just got here.
Yeah, and I like your perspective, because this is what I'm dying to have a conversation with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Because there's like no singular leadership in all of that, and even though it's a kind of an ethno-nationalist movement, but I really commend your interest, and I hope that you can channel it into a pragmatic approach, right? So we all have these ideals and our values, and then we have reality on the ground. And so, you know, one thing I've learned at work now, being in the away from academia, is I say, what are my top 3 priorities for this project or for this community that, you know, we need to invest in development? And I literally carve out 3 things. And you have to remember the example with Obamacare, right? This concept, the aspiration is universal health care. And the president, you know, the then president, President Obama aspired to that. But ultimately, because of the structure in place, because of what it was required to get it through, he had to compromise on that ideal so that the final product wasn't maybe a mirror of the aspiration to begin with, right? But it's what got it to, like, manifest itself in reality, in a sense, right? Imperfect, and all the other criticisms aside, it moved our society forward in that direction. And so I think the conversation that needs to be had when it comes to these dissensions is, what is the result of our internal fighting? Nothing. What 3 goals can we have in common that we want to try to achieve in the next 2 years, and give it a timeline, right? And so when you start to become that voice, because there's a vacuum for it, that voice of that kind of pragmatic, solution-based approach in the midst of the idealism and the aspirations, you can always keep your aspirations. That's what fuels you, that's what drives you, that's what motivates you. But carve out and use the system and the avenues that are literally on the ground, you know, the community meetings or whatever, the top 3 votes, top 3 issues that are of interest to people between this age and this age living in Houston, and why you should care about these 3 issues, and make that a flyer, right? Kind of just carving out action steps.
We got another question from way back, right there.
Yeah, thank you for your time and for this great presentation. I have a question, basically, what do you think that people here should do generally about Rojava? I mean, apparently Turkey is taking over about 32 miles or 32 kilometers within Syrian, within the border. That's almost half of the Kurdish majority Rojava. And I think also with the changes, geopolitical changes, the Syrian regime will take the rest of Rojava. So if things go the way they are now, in a few months there will be no Rojava if things don't change. So what do you think people here can do to push American policymakers, the U.S. is a very strong power there. As U.S. was in Syria, nothing was happening. The region was safe. So the minute that the U.S. decided to withdraw from Rojava, all the things happened. The Turks came in, the Syrians came in, and also Russians came in. And if things go the way they are now, I think it's very dangerous. So what's your suggestion for people here?
I can think of a few things. First of all, pressuring your political representatives, either writing to them an email or just calling them and making sure that they understand that you care about Kurds, and then you show them that actually, like Senator Lindsey Graham and Van Hollen from both parties said, that America shouldn't have a stain on its honor, and America shouldn't let its ally being butchered by genocidal regimes. So I think that's very important. Number two, I believe Colin will mention also the donating to the Kurdish Red Cross. So they have actually people on the ground right now helping everybody that live in Rojava. Please think of that as well. Number three, involving with the Kurdish community here. Naturally, we are going to have more events, and we are going to make sure that our voice are heard. If you're present there, then the representatives also will say that, we'll see that you care. And then two more ideas. One is boycotting the products from countries that are killing the Kurds now. If you are buying any, including the airlines. I'm not going to tell you which airline is that.
Turkish Airlines.
And then finally, Dwight Eisenhower documented all the concentration camps in Europe, and that's what changed the American public's opinion about the Jews. Before World War II, Jews were not that popular and not really that accepted in America as well, but Holocaust, and then after that, Eisenhower's policies as a general and as a president made sure that American public showed support for Israel and the Jewish plight after the Holocaust. So I'm thinking changes in school curriculums and defending that, making sure that American children learn, growing up, Armenian genocide, what happened to Kurds, and the Yazidi genocide that happened almost under the watch of President Obama in 2014. Then I think American children, when they grow up, they will think differently and they will care more. And I think that's also in the long term something that you can defend.
And adding to the pragmatic conversation, we're all on Facebook, and so you can, he says, write to your representative. Well, why don't you provide all your friends, 3 or 4 sentences, so that all they have to do is forward it and tell them who to contact, right? Those are the kind of proactive strategies that you can take to assist people with spreading the word. Same thing, write down top 10 companies that maybe shouldn't be supported, and share that information. The point about kind of the Holocaust awareness is so important, in that it took kind of a diffusion theory across society, right? Which takes a little bit of time, but now we have social media, so it goes faster.
So I think we've got a question, over there, and then over there.
Hi, I was just wondering, could you update us, with the most recent developments with the SDF deals, either with the regime or with the Russians, what the situation is on the ground, currently?
Sure. I didn't want to go into details at the beginning, but now that you asked. So right now, after the agreement in Sochi between presidents of Russia and Turkey, there is a joint patrol that is going on. 0 to 10 kilometers of Turkish border with Rojava right now is being patrolled jointly by Russian and Turkish troops. And that includes every single town on the border. except Kamışlı, which is the biggest population center there, which has a lot of Christians in there. So everybody was expecting, including President Trump and the administration, that that will bring actually stability to the region, but unfortunately it did not, because the jihadi thugs are currently attacking a town called Tel Temir, which is an ancient Assyrian Christian town, which was Christianized 65 after Christ. Okay, one of the earliest Christian sites in the world is right now, today, as of now, under attack by jihadi thugs. 14 Yazidi villages were evacuated because of the same reason, right on the border. And the ceasefire somehow holding in some areas, but majority of the areas the fight is going on. American soldiers came back from Iraq, back into Syria. They are patrolling the easternmost part of the border with Turkey right now because there are oil fields there. And then they're also being deployed to south towards Deir ez-Zor desert, where the biggest Conoco oil fields are located. So if you think of Syria, like if you think of Rojava like a rectangle, at the east part, think of it perpendicularly from south to north. Americans are active now up to the Turkish border because that's where oil is. You go then a little bit to the west of it, the second, think of it, the second line from south to north. That's where regime, Russia and Turkey playing some kind of game. The third section of Rojava from north to south are under jihadi thugs attacks even today. And the fourth section where Manbij and Kobani, where Kurds fought valiantly, is under imminent threat of jihadi thugs attack. So basically America is helping in 1/4, Russia is kind of trying to balance in the 2/4, and 1/4 is under constant attack. And very unfortunate that most Christians live in that part.
Okay, I think there's one other question, and then we probably are. Did you have a question, Eric? Can you wait for the microphone so other folks can hear you?
I just wanted to ask what you think are the chances that in this cauldron of conflict with Turkish irredentism, Erdogan has published maps showing Turkey reacquiring parts of northern Syria. It's been part of his regime from the very beginning. What do you think are the chances that the Kurdish people will be able to work some sort of accommodation with Assad to retain a measure of autonomy if they were to ally against the Turks with the Syrians? Is that a possibility?
So the balance is very delicate right now. Actually, I should have alluded that in her question as well, in a sense that SDF just released a statement, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is the umbrella organization that includes Kurdish fighters, but also Christians and Arabs and other minorities as well. They released a statement that they will not accept the offer of Ministry of Defense of Syria, which asked them to join as part of the Syrian army. The reason being is they want the special status of Rojava, which we have been alluding, which is completely different than the Ba'athist killer regime of Assad. They want to keep that autonomy somehow. And the only way to do that is basically through negotiations with Damascus. And that can only happen if the world powers want it so. And unfortunately, Kurds in the history have always been very unfortunate that the only thing that Soviet Union and United States of America agreed on was that to not give any autonomy to Kurds in the Middle East, which is very interesting. But right now, I think it's a little bit different. Both Russia and the United States want to find a solution to the Kurdish problem in specifics of Syria. So I believe they will force Assad to sit at the table with Kurds to redraft a new constitution that is more accepting to the differences that Rojava has, and also keep the autonomy of Syrian Democratic Forces as a distinct military entity. If that is to be reached, yes, probably at the end still we Kurds, we will lose some of our thousands-year-old historic homeland right on the Turkish border, because I have to allude that to everybody. 99% of the Kurds are living from 0 to 20 miles from the Turkish border. And that's where Turkish military wants to take now as part of their plan to resettle Arabs. Basically, that's the project that Bashar al-Assad's father, Hafez al-Assad, called the Arab Belt. He wanted to move all the Kurds from the Turkish border down to the desert around Deir ez-Zor, and Hafez al-Assad in the 60s and 70s, and settle all the Arabs there. And unfortunately, now the Turkish government is trying to implement a Ba'athist propaganda using the jihadi thugs, kicking the Kurds from their homeland, sending them to the desert. President Trump, I hope and pray that he reconsiders his position about this. But he also tweets that maybe it's time for Kurds to go to oil region. Right now, the situation is very tense for us, but I believe with all the wins that we made, that the fight that we fought on behalf of humanity, both the United States and Russia would make sure that Assad sit at the table and accept the differences that Rojava has to offer and find a good concession where Turkish security concerns, Syria's unity concerns, and Kurds' very legitimate concerns are all addressed, where it makes all parties happy and unhappy in some sense.
So thank you. I think I'd like to invite you to give our speakers a round of applause. So that concludes our evening's program. Thank you all for joining us. And if you ever want to come check out First Unitarian Universalist, we meet here on Sunday mornings at 10:30.